May the Lord Jesus give you his peace. Continuing in something of a novena between June 13th and June 21st, St. Anthony of Padua and St. Aloysius Gonzaga, with the theme of purity especially. And the more I think of it, the more I get to like the idea, just because of the time of year, and more you hear, the guys, you wouldn't believe what it's like out there. I can't even drive down the street without seeing something I don't want to see. And so, in preparation, we've moved from purity of speech, with St. Anthony of Padua being our paradigm, and now into purity of vision with St. Aloysius. Certainly both of these saints being great models for the whole realm of purity. The gospel reading for today from St. Matthew chapter 6, beautiful Sermon on the Mount, getting at treasures in heaven. I'd like to see it as something of a seminal verse, a very important verse for Marian consecration, because in Marian consecration we give our treasure, the deepest treasure that we have, which is our supernatural life, the theological stuff of which is called merits and satisfactions. We give that to the Immaculate Heart of Mary. And for where your treasure is, there also will your heart be. And our heart being in the Immaculate Heart by that act. And consequently, in theology, there's something called circumcinctio, whereby one heart dwells in the other. There is really an exchange of hearts that's being given with Marian consecration. And then we go on to the next teaching, which is quite beautiful. The lamp of the body is the eye. And if your eye is sound, or if your eye is single or unmixed or unadulterated, then your whole body will be filled with light. And St. Augustine will look at that and he'll say, it's purity of intention that's being taught here, which is clear because the next teaching that we'll hear is you cannot serve God and mammon. There's no two masters. There's only one master, and decide who to serve. And consequently, this purity of intention is something we want to look at. And with that, the Catechism has beautiful teaching on the battle for purity, and one of them is this purity of intention we'll look at. But before that, just to recommend to you, and the radiance of this teaching is so vast, it would take perhaps a week of conferences. In July, in this book called A Year with the Saints, which is online, Tan has put the whole thing online, which is a great gift for the church. There's a teaching on simplicity. And here is St. Francis de Sales on simplicity of heart. He says it's the perfection of all perfections. This is found when our soul fixes her glance, remember the eye, this intention, the soul fixes her glance solely upon God and restrains herself that she may apply all her powers simply and with complete fidelity to the observance of her rules and the methods prescribed to her, without turning aside to desire or wish to undertake any other thing. In this way, as she does not work by her own will or do anything unusual or greater than others, she has no great satisfaction or high opinion of herself, but God alone greatly delights in her simplicity, by which she ravishes his heart and unites herself to him. This is especially easy if you're in consecrated life. That is to say, at least it's prescribed. What am I supposed to be doing today? And consequently, as novices, our principal duties certainly are to imbibe the rule. What does our rule and constitution say by which we are to live? And also, during this year of novitiate, to apply ourselves to progress and mental prayer. Those two things being something of linchpins in simplicity, both in the doing and also in the praying, or the being. And it's this that the Catechism will also teach us in terms of, that's more along the purity of act. But here is the Catechism in a section from 2520 to 2528. This is just one entry. It's almost like four fronts of purity that it will span out for us, and one in particular we'll concentrate on. Baptism, the Catechism writes, confers on its recipient the grace of purification from all sins, but the baptized must continue to struggle against concupiscence of the flesh and disordered desires. With God's grace, he will prevail. Then these four fronts. By the virtue and gift of chastity, for chastity lets us love with upright and undivided heart. That word undivided gets at that single eye. By purity of intention, which consists in seeking the true end of man. With simplicity of vision, the baptized person seeks to find and to fulfill God's will in everything. And that's the task that we're focusing on, especially today. by purity of vision, external and internal, by discipline of feelings and imagination, by refusing all complicity in impure thoughts that incline us to turn aside from the path of God's commandments. And the quote from Wisdom, appearance arouses yearning in fools. Perhaps something we can concentrate on tomorrow with St. Aloysius, this purity of vision. And the last of these four fronts, by prayer. This is St. Augustine, who is a great model. I thought that continence arose from one's own powers, right? St. Augustine's great battle with continence and chastity, which I did not recognize in myself. I was foolish enough not to know that no one can be continent unless you grant it. This is very close to the prayer of Solomon. For you would surely have granted it if my inner groaning had reached your ears, and I with firm faith had cast my cares on you. So that purity, which these four fronts, the gift of chastity overall, the purity of intention, the purity of vision, and by prayer, we want to focus that eye, which is the lamp of the body, on the simplicity. It's one of the 6 virtues that St. Francis will salute, or that he will hail in his salutation to the virtues. And it is that sister virtue, which is the sister of Queen Wisdom. In one sense, you could say all of these things, all the 6 virtues that St. Francis will point out to us are most important, but this one we want to say is especially important because we say it's the from. It's the from virtue, which is the intellectual virtue, which will radiate into the for of wisdom, so that we're able to take on this vision of the wisdom of the cross, which is so fundamental to the Franciscan charism. But the simplicity is something that, again, we want to be very, very proficient in. And again, I want to refer you to this work, The Year with the Saints, in the month of July. The Catechism has a very important teaching on this, which it repeats in 2 passages. And here's one of them, 2604, and the second is 2610. It's about the prayer of Jesus. And it's saying that the second prayer before the raising of Lazarus is recorded by St. John. Thanksgiving precedes the event. Father, I thank you for having heard me, which implies that the Father always hears his petitions. Jesus immediately adds, I know that you always hear me, which implies that Jesus on his part, this is italicized, constantly made such petitions. Jesus' prayer, characterized by thanksgiving, reveals to us how to ask. Before the gift is given, Jesus commits himself to the one who in giving gives himself. The giver is more precious than the gift. He is the treasure. This is especially for us in Marian consecration because we receive great gifts. We enter into the universal mediation of the Immaculate Mediatrix and consequently share in her quasi-infinite merits and the great gifts that go along with that, not to get caught up with the gifts. And so Jesus teaches us how to process this, let's say. Before the gift is even given, Jesus commits himself to the one who in giving gives himself, and with thanksgiving, resigning ourselves completely to the giver. And then do with me what you will. A very important teaching, because that concupiscence towards avarice, which St. Francis will say, that the flesh will want to steal even the goods of the soul, and consequently being on our guard against that. So that's how to ask. Before the gift is given, giving ourselves completely to the giver. And secondly, what a corollary to this teaching in Catechism entry 2610 is to ask with filial boldness, with great confidence. I know that you always hear me. And those 2 things, a simplicity of vision and prayer that can radiate out into the wisdom of the cross.